Welcome, everyone. My name is Kat Brooks. I'm the Executive Director of the Justice Teams Network. I'm also the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project. This is the 7th in our We Take Care of Us series, where we are looking at creating just and equitable and beautiful and thriving communities that do not rely on militarized law enforcement, punitive policing, or the mass incarceration of our people. We've been listening to you, and so we hope that you're going to find this webinar super accessible. We both have Spanish translation as well as captioning as well as ASL, and you can choose the channel that you need for Spanish, which I believe Danielle is going to talk about right now. Go ahead, Danielle.
Muy bienvenidos a todos y todas. Gracias por acompañarnos en esta sesión sobre la justicia transformativa. Si quieren la interpretación en español, por favor, escogen la opción por su idioma en la pantalla abajo. En la pantalla hay opciones por inglés y español. Muchísimas gracias otra vez por acompañarnos.
I have been looking forward to this panel for weeks. I feel incredibly honored and humbled to be able to be in conversation with two folks that I think are doing amazing work in our communities, both locally and across the country. We are joined today by Mimi Kim, who is the founder of Creative Interventions and a co-founder of Incite. She has been a longtime activist and advocate challenging gender-based violence at its intersection with state violence. As a second-generation Korean American, she locates her political work in the global solidarity with feminist anti-imperialist struggles, seeking not only the end of oppression, but of the creation of liberation here and now. Good afternoon, Mimi. Thank you so much for joining us. We are also joined today by Mia Mingus, a writer and educator for disability justice and transformative justice. She's passionate about building the skills, relationships, and structures that can transform violence, harm, and generational cycles of abuse within our communities, and that do not rely on or replicate the punitive system we currently live in. Her writings can be found on her blog, Leaving Evidence. Good afternoon, Mia.
Good afternoon.
So the way this is going to work, well, first of all, I just want to remind you all, I don't know your speaking styles. I talk very fast. And so in the Zoom accessibility culture, I've had to learn to pace myself so that our ASL interpreter can make it through the hour and not be exhausted at the end. So the way this is going to work, y'all, is that first I'm going to turn it over to Mimi to talk about your work. You can take as long as you'd like. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mia to talk about your work. You can take as long as you like. And then I will ask a few questions. For the audience that's listening, please put your question in the Q&A box. Do not put them in the chat. The chat box moves. I can't find it. If people get mad, they think I ignored them, and I didn't. It just got lost in comments. So let's put everything in Q&A. I will get to as many people as I can in the hour, which I imagine with these two brilliant people is going to fly by very quickly. All right, Mimi, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Kat. I also am very honored to be in conversation with you. So I'm a longtime fan and admirer, and I haven't had a chance to meet you until now. So this has been a real honor for me, and of course, thrilled to be sitting next to Mia Mingus. At least our squares are next to each other. And as we remind some of you, we are two different people. Our names get confused. We're both doing transformative justice work, but I have to say, that we've both been doing a long time. I know Mia sometimes says, I think, was it first generation, generation 1.5. So I'm like first generation in that. As a co-founder of Incite, some of you will be very familiar with Incite and some of you may not. Incite is an organization that started back in 2000, which is 20 years ago now. We just had a celebration of our 20 years the end of April. Incite is a really important social movement organization to me. I think to many people, because at that time, I had been working for a long time on gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault. I had actually done a lot of work with a lot of folks in my communities to start programs in the Korean American community, because we had, at that time, had very few of any at all. So I came up at a time when we were trying to make accessible spaces for our communities, so people could actually call somebody who could speak Korean, and we could understand the culture, somebody could actually talk about the shame and fear of violence, and look for solutions within our own community, and not trying to go outside, or more likely not even knowing that anything was available. What I did find, though, was there was a real limitation in the kind of services we were developing. So this was, you know, I still think that we do need, at this time, we still need shelters and so on, but there was a way in which everything was around escape. That if you are facing a violent situation, whether it be sexual violence or domestic violence, interpersonal violence, that you needed to leave that relationship, you needed to get out, you need to escape as an individual and as someone disconnected from your communities. And in a way, the ways in which I know many people in my community have been very, very connected to our families, caring what people think, relying upon each other, was looked upon in a kind of a white Western frame as overly dependent, childlike, and so on, and was discouraged. And for many people, they didn't want to leave a relationship. They didn't think that was an option for them. They actually preferred staying. They knew that escaping might mean leaving their entire community. So that is not that different than it is today. Unfortunately, that's 20 years ago I'm describing. For many people, if you're going to call a shelter or a hotline or a crisis line, this is still the kind of assumption that you're going to have. I also saw how I was part of a movement that had gone increasingly towards law enforcement. Call 911. I was on all of our hotlines, still is. Violence Against Women Act is part of the crime bill. VAWA is still part of the Department of Justice, which is where law enforcement rests. So I think that many of us, particularly in communities of color and queer communities, immigrant communities, were feeling like these options, for one, still were not very available to us. Two, didn't meet our needs, and were not what we were looking for. And yet we were really entrapped in this kind of framework. So I think that that was a long time coming. And when Incite first started in 2000, again, a long time ago, we just thought there would be a couple hundred people coming to a gathering in Santa Cruz. And instead we had almost 2,000, primarily people of color, and primarily women of color, or femme-identified people of color, queer people of color, that were coming into that space and saying, no, we're looking for something different. We care very much about gender-based violence, but we care very much about state violence. And we have been forced to either do things ourselves or to be part of these kinds of systems that have relied on law enforcement, and we need to do something else. So I think that for me was a really important time in actually centering ourselves as communities of color and not being just on the peripheries talking about what we needed, but never finding a way to ever get there. And I think also that was a time when Generation 5 was starting to talk in the Bay Area about transformative justice and for child sexual abuse, and I'll let Mia talk more about that as well in the beginning of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. So that was an important, I think, collective space for me and for many others to actually center our political analysis, but also look at the kinds of interventions and solutions and prevention frameworks that we were going to have to actually create responses. Some of those responses that we already were starting, but many of which we really felt the call to do in a very much more intentional way at that time. And that's where you saw a lot of different efforts start. Creative interventions being one in the Bay Area in 2004, but other things like Support New York, Spirit House in Durham, Support New York, Philly Stands Up, and other communities against rape and assault, CARA in Seattle. And a lot of us started talking with each other and having conversations. What are you doing? And we all had a different approach that we were doing in our own local communities based upon who we had, the kind of visions we had. But what we found is we had a very aligned political vision, and we had certain kinds of things that we were trying to do. How are we going to actually respond to violence without calling the police? How are we going to respond to violence without necessarily relying on the kinds of services that we've had, because they would tell us to call the police? What would look different if you actually brought people together who were involved, who were the friends and the family and the community members that were very much impacted by violence? What would it even be like to imagine that we would bring in the person who had caused harm? And that's, I think, when a lot of us were changing the language from perpetrator, rapist, and so on, and batterer, and starting to use a more neutral language, a politically open language around person who had done harm. But really, in reality, when we were talking about a particular situation, we were just using their name and not necessarily a label. So what would it look like if it were your friend? What would it look like if it was your brother? What would it look like if it was another person in your community? What would it look like if it were yourself? To actually engage with others that perhaps that you're harming and you are being harmed by the other people that were in your community, and what I think BATJC has brilliantly started calling pods. We didn't have that language at the time. And really try to transform that violence, transform our way of thinking about violence, transform our relationships to that violence, transform as individuals, and transform really as communities. That is the kind of work we've been doing since that time in various formations called Creative Interventions, BTGC. Now we have many more, Project Mia, Just Practice, and so on. How are we doing that? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What can we learn from each other? And how do we open this up to our to most impacted communities? So I'm just that's a little bit of a historical introduction to how I got into the work, and what I see is really like a beautiful community of people across the country and really globally that have done this with more intention, but also that get our inspiration from our own legacies of resistance and resilience from our various communities. So I think, I don't know if Kat, you want to take this or just turn it over to Mia.
I'll just do a few logistics and then I will turn it over to Mia. Again, if you have questions for our esteemed panelists, please put them in the Q&A and at the chat box. We have ASL, we have captioning, we have Spanish translation for those who would like to engage on those channels. Mia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. I realize in these formats, I'm like, I don't know when people can see me or not. So I realize I need to stop fidgeting and just be here. Thanks so much for having me on this. And, you know, Mimi and I were talking like 2 weeks ago and she was just like, you want to be on this radio show with me? I was like, sure, why not? So it's really great to be here with you all. So I think a little bit about the work that I have been doing in TJ. So I've been in this for a long time also, but I do consider myself, as Mimi said, I always joke with Mimi that I'm like the 1.5 gen. Like, I feel like, you know, there's like those of us who kind of straddle the like OG, and then like the newer generation that we're seeing getting, you know, politicized now, which is really exciting. And also, I can't stress to people enough who are just learning about TJ for the first time, or even prison abolition at large, to please do your work and read about folks who have come before you, because there's so many great people who have laid the foundation and groundwork for this moment, and a lot of groups and leaders that their names should be known. So if you're new to TJ, please do that. And there's resources everywhere. Transformharm.org is a great place to get tons and tons more readings than you even want to have. So for me, I came into this work doing work around ending child sexual abuse, and specifically, I think within transformative justice work. So one, I want to say that transformative justice work has historically been led by people responding to intimate and sexual violence. So domestic violence, intimate partner violence, child abuse, child sexual abuse, I'm going to slow down, rape, sexual assault. So I want to say that really clearly because I came in doing this work around child sexual abuse, and I feel like of all the TJ work, like we're still a smaller minority of people, like in terms of that specific form of violence. But I also mention the forms of violence that transformative justice focuses on to also remind people that what I've been seeing happening is that people have been taking a lot of the tools that we've created specifically around those particular forms of violence and trying to use them carte blanche and apply them to like state violence, for example. And I just want to remind everybody that different forms of violence require different kinds of responses, and that's okay. That's okay. So, for example, we don't have to have empathy for the state, right? Like the reason why a lot of the TJ tools look the way they do or have been crafted is because they were made, they were, like crafted in the fires of our intimate networks of our communities. And that's very different than if we're going to respond to state violence or institutional violence, for example. So I just want to say that. So my work has been primarily around ending child sexual abuse, although I do work around all different types of violence, in terms of domestic violence, sexual assault, etc. And I think that we're in a moment now where transformative justice is really blowing up, which is, like I said, it's really wonderful. And I also think that, we're in a historical moment where people are really grasping for alternatives to our current systems. And I don't mean alternatives meaning like reforms. I mean like people are like, well, how do we actually build the world that we actually want? And so for me, a lot of my work has focused on not only transformative justice, like interventions and like, what do we do? How do we help a domestic violence survivor, for example? How do we assist somebody who has been sexually assaulted or raped? But it's also been about how do we also pull back and look at how harm can escalate into violence? How do we start to practice transformative justice in our everyday lives? Kat, like a lot of us don't even know how to tell our friend or our comrade that they hurt our feelings. So let alone respond to like a murder or, that's happened in the community or, child abuse that's going on. And so a lot of my work lately, I feel like in the past 4 or 5 years, has really been the work of saying, hey, like, let's back up a little bit and let's really build our skill sets around these everyday types of, not forget violence, harm, and abuse. We have a hard time even dealing with conflict, misunderstandings, hurt. We don't even know how to deal with that well. And one of the reasons why I've been focusing a lot on that is because I say this all the time, but if we're not going to use police, if we're not going to use prisons, if we're not going to use the court system or ICE, Border Patrol, foster care system, etc., then that means it's us. It's easy to go on Twitter or Facebook and say like, no police, no prisons. It's much harder to build the kind of community infrastructure and really the kind of relationships with each other that we're going to need to be able to make that a reality. And, I think we're in a moment now where we're seeing that these realities are actually a possibility for us to be able to live in, or at least get some things in through this window as it stays open. And just to be clear, I'm not arguing for like nicer police. I'm fighting for no police. And so a lot of my work has been about, hey, like if we're not going to use these state systems, then that means we are the ones who are going to have to respond to things like stalking, to things like bullying, to things like abuse of power within our organizations, within our families, within our communities. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it back over to you is I think a lot of my work too has focused on building alternatives. So making a distinction between like just resistance work right? Folks who are resisting the world against the way it is, which we absolutely need. It's super important. People who are fighting back against harmful policies, right? People who are out in the streets protesting. And then there's this other piece of work to me that is about how are we actually building that? And whatever movement you're talking about, whether it's food justice, whether it's housing and land liberation, whether it's prison abolition in the form of transformative justice. But how do we actually then, what does that infrastructure look like? Does it look like a network of safe houses where survivors can flee and get protection if they need to leave their home? Obviously, we want people to be able to stay in their communities and homes, but if they need to get out, what do? Or for a harmer, we might need to remove somebody from a violent situation. It doesn't mean we want to lock them up in a cage, but they might need to be removed, and that's a reality, right? Does it look like helping to shift and change the conditions that make violence even possible? And that is cross-movement building work, liberation work at large. So I just say that to say that, I think that in my work, I'm thinking macro and micro all the time, because, when we're running a TJ intervention, for example, we're talking about working with at least 4 to maybe 8 to 12 people. And I know everybody on this call knows it's hard to get your 4 friends together for dinner, people who you want to see, let alone having to organize meetings with people for like 2-3 years, people you may not even know necessarily. So I'll just stop there.
It's fire today. Thank you, Mia and Mimi. I have so many questions. The awareness to me is losing my mind. I want to remind our audience that you can place your questions for Mia and Mimi in the Q&A box. I will get to them as I can. I try to get all. I will do my absolute best. The first place I want to start actually is because what I've noticed lately is that, and excuse the background noise and the things, I'm in the sticks. I actually was targeted by some white supremacists, so I had to get out of Dodge. So I am looking for internet in the world of COVID. And it's like, it's a thing, right? I'm safe. I just apologize for the additional noise. So one of the things that I've noticed is that the words transformative justice and restorative justice get thrown around as if they are the same thing. And I would like, let me start with you, Mia, and then we can go to you, Mimi. Are they the same thing, or what are the important differences that those of us doing this work should understand?
This is a great question, Kat. I'm like, how long do you have?
As long as you have, babe.
I'll give you my kind of quick and dirty of it, and then Mimi, please jump in at any point. Sure. So the way that I understand it, so one, they are different. I think that's really important to remember. It's important to know that they both fall under the umbrella of like community-based responses to violence or collective responses to violence. But transformative justice comes explicitly out of a prison abolition framework, whereas restorative justice doesn't necessarily. And there's a lot of differences, so I'll just pull out some of them. One is that, so before I get into differences, actually, let me just say that I believe that both of them are important. I am not here saying that one is better than the other. I think that we need both of them, and that actually there are places where restorative justice can get to that transformative justice is not able to get to, and vice versa. So one important distinction, though, is the way that things have been rolling out. So restorative justice tends to be more, and has been like getting embedded more in state systems, which is a very different thing than transformative justice, where we usually are working outside of state systems. Sometimes, of course, we might utilize some social services like counseling or what have you, but largely we are operating outside the state. Whereas restorative justice, we're seeing it being embedded into schools. There are even some, criminal justice, criminal legal processes where you can choose a restorative justice path if you want to, for example. Another big, huge difference, restorative justice and transformative justice, is that a lot of restorative justice has been co-opted from Native and Indigenous peoples from this land. And so the ways that restorative justice were originally envisioned and operated, I think it's important to remember that it was created within a certain set of conditions and a certain context, right? In terms of indigenous communities and native communities where everybody knew each other, for example. Everybody had shared language or shared values, shared spiritual values even. We don't live in those types of same situations anymore, especially when we talk about responding to harm in metropolitan areas, for example. People may not even share the same language, let alone values. Another big difference is restorative justice and transformative justice. Transformative justice has, I feel like, largely also included systemic power analysis and understanding of systemic power. Whereas a big critique in restorative justice has been the kind of focusing on like more collective injustice, collective justice, for example, at the sacrifice sometimes of individual justice. And so there are survivors, for example, who have said, you know, I went through this restorative justice process and the community felt great, but I still felt like shit. Can I curse here? I'm really apologizing if I can't. But like, you know, that has
talking
been...
to Cat Brooks.
All right, good, because yeah, it's pretty hard not to. And then I would just say that, you know, when I talk about the co-opting thing, I also just want to say one thing that always feels important to mention is that restorative justice and transformative justice, neither of them are monolithic. So there is a varying degree of thought and peoples and communities within both sections, right? And so in restorative justice, you have everybody from like white folks bringing in dream catchers and feathers to like people who are much more aligned with transformative justice, but who are like, I understand my work as being in service of, you know, a day where we could get to a place where we could do transformative justice, for example. And so it brings me back to my first point, which is I think they are both important right now. And I think, thank you. I think they're both important right now. And I also think that restorative justice, again, can get to places where TJ may not be able to. Like if we can lessen the amount of, you know, Black and brown kids who are going from in the school to prison pipeline, for example, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing, right? So I also think that there's a lot more overlap, and you know, there's a lot of TJ practitioners, including myself, who utilize circle practice, for example, in our work. So those are some differences. Mimi, I don't know what you would add.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot of what I would have said. I mean, they come from different historical trajectories and political trajectories. But what we find is a lot of people who work in TJ, transformative justice, and I can say for myself, one thing that I have more recently been doing is learning more about the methods that have been developed within restorative justice, and have found now, and the methods are vastly different across practices. They can be really unrecognizable. So there is not one method. But I have been learning more about a particular kind of circle approach, and it's the reason it's been useful, at least for me in my experience, was that a lot of our work in creative interventions also came out of rapid response. How are we going to rapidly respond to violence that we hear about now without calling the cops? And we also moved into processes, which Amia was describing, things that can be years long. And that is a different kind of thing. And I think that with the work that I did earlier, I felt like I had a lot to learn about what those processes look like. I've learned now so much more from people who come after me. I mean, I learned tons from Mia. I learned tons from Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan and people from Just Practice. So, but I'm also learning certain things from people who have developed these circle responses about preparation, what a circle could look like. And even the circle technique, which I would not naturally ever pass a talking piece around, but sometimes that can be useful in certain situations. So there's that kind of at the level of the method, and there is some kind of blending that can happen. But in terms of the systems response, I agree that restorative justice has come mostly out of systems-based responses. as diversion from, but still part of law enforcement. Not every single restorative justice process has, or program has, but for the most part, that has been true. So there's a way in which when people say restorative justice, it tends to be within a kind of an audience where it's amenable to, you know, we don't like the cops. I mean, it's bad, but we still want them, right? We want to, and then it gets worked in through the district attorney's office, and who gets to control everything? Basically, it means that a lot of restorative justice responses are going to happen because you get arrested first, and then you get funneled through. It means that law enforcement can play a very essential role in that process, or gets to decide what's acceptable and what's not. And gets to decide whether, okay, you didn't go through the process, so now you're going to be incarcerated, or that you are incarcerated and the restorative justice process is happening while you're in jails and prisons. Now, we see that as some kind of harm reduction, possibly. And so I don't want to completely erase a particular value that some of those programs might have. But I think there's a confusion then. And then if we look at and I say a lot of people who do restorative justice type programs, they go, oh, I love the word transformative. I'm going to start saying that now. I'm like, no, you are not. Actually, I mean, I'm not one that's very dogmatic about language in general. But if you are working with law enforcement, you are not transformative justice, period. So there's a way in which transformative justice has really developed and continues to develop within very autonomous spaces with, you know, mixed reliance on no money, sometimes leaping off of some of the project that got funded. Restorative justice does tend to be more heavily funded. I think now what we have to worry about is with this kind of huge, like, defund the police, and this was already happening 5 years ago, I saw it. And part of it is the work that we've done over time. Believe me, there was many years, and it's still now today, where people that were working in domestic and sexual violence said, oh, hell no. There's no way you're going to ever bring these people together. What are you doing? And in fact, I just did a webinar 2 days ago, and I said, one of the chats was, hell no, we're not going to do that. Why don't we just reform the police? So what we're going to see right now, I think, with this increased attention and demand and excitement, is that I think there's going to be a lot of money put into restorative justice in a way that actually can prop up the system and extend the system in ways that look like, oh, thank God we're doing something about this terrible police problem, but may just be a kind of a ploy, for some people well-intended, that actually looks like you're doing something, but only extends the reach of law enforcement. That is what I'm concerned about. And I really think that we need to stress that warning. There's now funding for restorative justice federal programs and centers. What do they rely on? They definitely prioritize law enforcement. They say you have to have like very rigorous evaluations that are randomized control trials. I don't think we're doing a randomized control trial, right? So this is the ways in which I think a white supremacist carceral system is going to, and has already, taken this genuine interest in restorative and transformative justice, but make sure that it only looks like a certain way that's going to not really do anything to dismantle law enforcement.
Mia, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, can I just add one thing, which is the way, I think one short way to think about it too is that one difference is transformative justice works to transform the conditions which allowed for the harm to occur, whereas traditionally restorative justice has worked to restore the relationships to what they were before the harm happened. Whereas transformative justice folks would say, no, actually, we believe the relationships as they were part of the conditions that allowed for the harm to happen in the first place. So that might be a helpful distinction.
Both of your commentary were extremely helpful. Thank you for that, because it's been something that, like, you know, I sort of twitch every time I hear people intermingling those words and like the difference. And like I want to bring up Grace in Michigan, right? The young woman who initially was not sent to jail for not doing her homework, and then ultimately through a restorative justice process ended up behind bars because she didn't do her homework and had mental health issues, and there were no other responses besides 911 and the system to rely on. And so now that this young Black girl, and I've been very careful about now calling her a young woman because she's a child, is sitting behind bars because of a restorative justice process. Both of you, I'm gonna start using that term too. I'm a 1.5 or 2. Sniffing between folks that came before me and the young folks who I'm about to let take over this so I can retire. I want to get both of your thoughts, right? Like, I'm not interested in being 80 and inhaling tear gas. I'm good. But one of the things that I'm really interested in right now is that, this is, you hear people talk about this is the beginning in this particular moment. I'm like, this is not movement that I say started with the first enslaved African on indigenous land. But if we're gonna just talk police violence, really from the Panthers to Rodney King to Oscar Grant to Ferguson to now, is how I sort of benchmark the explosive moments. And one of the things that I've been saying is that we did a really good job, I think, particularly with the advent of Black Lives Matter, of impacting the public debate, right? Point. And I think we really did a really good job of shifting, or at least opening the pathways for people to shift the way they think about law enforcement, police, prisons, et cetera, in our country, and the relationship between police and Black communities in particular, but POC communities generally. I feel like we're in a moment of extraction. Like, for me, it feels like this particular moment that we're in is one of extraction. So the things that you all have been talking about for years, defund PD was founded 5 years ago by APTP. People were laughing us out of rooms, but we're in this moment where it's possible. And so I want to hear from you. I guess it's a dual pronged question. And Mimi, you got to some of this, but what are the pitfalls that we should be worried about in this moment? But 2, where do you see the possibilities of us really untangling law enforcement need to have a badge and a gun in terms of response?
So I missed a little bit of it. I think I caught enough of what you were asking, Kat. You cut out for a minute. Yeah, this is an incredible moment. I think I saw some version of this moment happening, but not. I don't know how many of us saw the extent to which this would be possible. So in some ways, we've had all of these years of preparation, right? The work that we've been doing, the work that got laughed at, as you said, Kat, and the work that we persisted in despite everything. I have seen in the anti-violence movement, for example, before this moment, some cracks made where there were state coalitions that started, state coalitions that had and domestic violence and sexual assault had always been behind any kind of enhanced penalty for sexual and domestic violence, actually start reversing that. So that had been happening already. And now this moment, though, is so enormous. And so there's so much potential that I think we have to jump in. And I find myself taking risks and having conversations with people I hadn't before. I was just on something with the American Bar Association, for example. I'm not sure that they would have invited me before. I'm not sure if I would have attended, but it seemed like an important place to go to start talking about some of the really cautions I had about restorative justice and this excitement to take it up. So I think that we, and I'm thinking about this more as, I think many of us are involved in local conversations, right, with city councils and county boards of supervisors about actually making moves to defund the police. This is happening everywhere, right? And we're all involved in these. So what is that moment to jump in and not have that door closed? one thing that we have to be cautious about when they say, well, obviously, like, let's just reduce it by $10,000. You know, I mean, there's some very obvious things in terms of what kind of level of defunding are we talking about. But then with the investment piece, which I think I feel like more that I've been in more in conversation about, is if you're going to, are you going to invest in your Department of Mental Health that's already tied to law enforcement? No. Are there opportunities because of the work that has been done previously in your particular Department of Health where you know people and you can make actually an inroad to do something significant? Well, if those opportunities are there, then look for those, or you already know what those are probably, because you've already built those relationships, you already have your people inside. So I don't want to like completely dismiss that, but it very much depends on the local conditions you have. Then how are you going to have that money be siphoned off into already existing organizations? And you know there's going to be a mad scramble for that by some organizations that shouldn't be getting that money and some that should. Hopefully we've already done our preparatory work so we know which organizations those are. And some of those organizations may be able to hold massive amounts of money and in a way that you don't have to spend it that next year, but they actually, you can do something strategic with that money. And I think that's going to be very important. I think the other thing is we have to build new things, or we have to build new things out of tiny seeds that might be there. And I want to make sure that as we have this defund police moment that, you know, everybody wants a quick fix. It's something that's done in 1 year. How are we going to push that open so that we're talking about 3-year plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, where things that we need to have and that are not there yet can actually be built by the right people? What kind of training do we need to do? What kind of new networks do we need to form or strengthen? Who can we bring into that? So I think that that's going to be very essential. There's other opportunities for us to do, and you know, I look to you, Kat, the brilliant work you've been doing with Mental Health First, as a beautiful example of something that's emerging, but that we can learn from. I know it's still, emergent stages, but how can we build more of those? How can we make sure you get that kind of funding so that you can have that in Oakland, in LA, and so on? You know, we have our own forums in LA. So I think these are exciting opportunities. I just want to talk for a moment, just because I also happen, I'm also a professor of social work at Cal State Long Beach, and there's been like defund the police, fund social work. But I'm very critical of social work because I think also social work has not been critical, and social work has also worked together with law enforcement. And this actually gives an opportunity for those of us who have been saying this all along to actually have. And there's like, I've seen an enormous buildup of conversations around this in platforms and demands by students for us to be talking about this. So I also see the ways in which some of us might be more like helping professions actually to be on the right side of the work and to join in with people who have been doing more radical work and transformative justice work and may have not ever known about it, but had kind of the compulsion towards that to actually jump in and become part of the infrastructure that we're building up.
I knew this was going to happen. I was like, I've got these two badass women on my panel, and the hour is going to fly by. There are so many questions from folks, and I have a ton of questions.
Mia, do you want to add anything to that? I know you have a lot to say.
Only, Kat, you tell us where you'd like us to go. I'm happy to go to the next question if you want me to.
Yeah, no, for sure, please. I definitely want you to respond, and then I actually want you both to sort of address this idea of scale, because to your point, yeah, so Mimi, we started MH First in Sacramento. We are in conversations now with the city of San Francisco, the city of Oakland, and the city of San Leandro. So this thing that was meant to be like completely off the grid, right? Because there was no place for us inside of the ways in which our cities function and no desire to be attached to 911 whatsoever, is now suddenly this thing that I feel like cities are like, oh, well, we can do that. Maybe people will go home. And so how do we scale and scale with integrity? So if you want to like add whatever you want to what Mimi said and then maybe address the scale question, that would be dope.
Absolutely. So, okay, first and foremost, in terms of opportunities, and then we'll move to the scale part. I mean, I think there's so many opportunities. Obviously, there's a lot of pitfalls, but like, I would like to spend my time in opportunities. One, I think this is a moment where us as abolitionists and all of us as revolutionary folks and folks who are fighting for liberation, this is a time that's really pushing us to get clear on what is it that we actually do want. Because defund the police is one thing, but like, I think for all of us, this is an opportunity to think through what is the world that we actually want though? Like, yeah, if we get rid of police, let's say like we're able to do that, then what are the things that we want and what are the things that we're going to need to be able to get us there? And, you know, I feel like part of what I see happening, which is really exciting in this moment, is because we have a pandemic on top of an uprising, we have been seeing people who are realizing, and many communities already knew this before, but more and more people, I think, are waking up to the reality that our government is not going to protect us, and it is not going to do for us, and we have to do for us, right? Our folks need to take our own livelihood and safety into our own hands. And so it's really been amazing to me to see the mutual aid, to see the pod work, to see people really investing in community, people meeting their neighbors when they never knew their neighbors for years and years and years until this pandemic hit. And now trying to be like spending all of March, April, you know, talking with their neighbors and helping them get groceries and things like that. I think part of what this scale up question to me, Kat, I just want to tell you that this is a soapbox that I could get on for like 17 hours to talk about, because I have a lot to say. So one is, dear funders, remember 15, 20 years ago when TJ people were trying to get funding to help to resource the work that we were trying to do, and people would not take political risks on us? Do you remember that? So now, to be faced with a moment where people are like, well, why don't you have scale? Why don't you have options that are built up to scale? Why is everything you have scrappy and small? And it's like, because we couldn't get the resources and the backing so that we could actually spend 10 years, 7 years trying things out and building them and making mistakes, learning from them, growing. Because I think the other thing about the scale question to me is also a pragmatic question in and of itself, because I think also we don't actually know if TJ, the way that we have built it so far, is scale upable. And so that's also part of what's going on, is that all of the models that we build, they will be built inside of the conditions that we are building them. Like, that's just period. So because we've been small, because we lack a lot of people power, oftentimes we don't have a deep bench of leadership. We will, hopefully, but we still are a very small little stream of people. All of the things we've built have been built in that context. So I also think that it is extremely unfair and a setup, quite frankly, to now say, well, now you all have to do this thing perfectly, when we haven't been in these spaces. So that's not to say that they can't get scaled up. I think that there's actually a lot of things that we could do, but they will take time. And what I see happening right now is people being pushed into the limelight, right? And pushed into center stage and saying, dance right away. And then if you can't, then you're terrible. And
I just want to interrupt in that and may take your conversation to a specific direction. So like, for instance, in Oakland, you know that we've gotten unanimous vote to create that will work for the next year to defund the Oakland Police Department by 50%. Not a new campaign, 5-year campaign, APTP. But that said, like, the thing that we're concerned about is, right, like, so in the first 3 weeks of that, of course there's going to be something that happens. Of course there's going to be something that explodes. And we're like, see, we told you Cab Brooks was crazy.
Exactly. And that's what I see happening. Like, people, for example, who don't take time to study, don't take time to learn, and then do a TJ process and say, oh, see, TJ doesn't work. And it's like, there's so many things about it that are not just like you need the skills and actually to practice them, but also the conditions that we're in a historical moment where we're still experimenting. with TJ. Like, we are still so steeped in punishment and criminalization that we don't even realize that we're doing it to ourselves. Most of us are in an abusive relationship with ourselves, like, let alone other people, right? Like, we still don't know. We're like a fish in water. And so I just say all that to say that I 100% think we can scale up things, but this is the time, though, to give big, dream big, and then give big support and spaciousness to people so that they can actually, because we don't even know how high we can fly yet. We don't even know, because we've never been given the proper support. And so APTP, BATJC, TJ at large, all of this, right? Responding to mental health crises, all of that. We have to have the space to do it. And, you know, and I think about it like, there's the defund work, but then there's the work to build alternatives. And that those two types of work are different, and that's okay. We can work together. We don't all have to be doing the same exact thing. So the only thing that I'll just add is that, you know, I think that when I think about transformative justice, I think about it as we are trying to break generational cycles. So every time that we're responding on a micro level to one incident, one person, I want everybody listening to think about how you can respond to that one act of violence in a way that helps us to ultimately end violence, to ultimately break generational cycles. And I'm hoping that this moment can also be a microcosm of that. How do we respond to this moment in a way that sets us up so that we have enough stability and sustainability to be able to actually do that work for generations? Because it's not going to happen in one campaign. It's not going to happen by everybody working for one great organization. Done.
I need another hour with both of you. Mimi, I want to, so we only, unbelievably, we only have 4 minutes left. And I want to get to, because, so we had an amazing webinar last Friday with, around non-law enforcement led response to domestic violence. And one of the things that I brought up was, you know, in our heads, and I think you both are old enough to remember Farrah Fawcett's Burning Bed, right? So when we talk about domestic violence and abusers, like, that's the image, right? And no joke, like, that person exists. But that's not the majority of people. Or like when we talk about prison abolition, you know, people talk about Jeffrey Dahmer or a pedophile. Like, they immediately go to the worst, and there's this illusion that the majority of people that are locked up in American concentration camps are people that are the worst of the worst of the worst. As I want to spend like these last few moments talking about, you know, root causes of trauma and harm, and the ways in which transformative justice can be a healing balm to even the people that we've demonized in our minds in order to build a greater and more just society that thrives for everybody.
Well, I don't have
I
don't have a beautiful answer to that. In fact, I had a better answer for scaling up, but I'm going to move on. I think that's part of the small experience we're doing. I think that it's, and in the small experience I've been doing experiments, whether it's creative interventions, or right now I'm working with a kind of an emerging like experiment around restorative processes, but not using law enforcement. We do not have any kind of prior thing of, oh, if it's lethal, then we're not going to do this. We just walk in saying, what is it that people are facing? And there are people, and I did this with creative interventions, people that had high levels of lethality, and you ask the questions, what can be done? Who has influence over them? What do they care about? So I'm not sure if, like, I have a hard time, I have to say, with the root causes question. I think definitely we have to look at the conditions of oppression and around, you know, capitalism and racism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, obviously. But how does that show up in somebody's life? And if you're doing a process, what are the ways in which you give people space to actually get at their own root causes and have an understanding of them without excusing their violence, but in a way that they can reflect on what do they not get and what can they offer to themselves and to somebody else. So it's like, I think it's very much in terms of those kinds of allowing for those tendrils to come in allowing that to happen in a way that, oh, you said you did that? Well, we're going to lock you up. But instead, it's like, okay, we have room, we have space for the truth here. And we have time for you to get to it. And I think that that's my way of responding to your root causes questions in terms of the kind of project that I think a lot of us are engaged in. Mia, I'll turn that over to you.
I have so many things to say
Thank
about
you.
this. In like,
Yeah, I want to be just clear that like I asked that question as someone who's been in multiple domestic violence relationships, as someone who's a survivor of sexual assault, as someone who has like walked a very hard road to becoming an abolitionist, right, and getting over my own hatred, right, and want for revenge for what was done to me. Mia, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this last question.
Yeah, no, but I just so appreciate what you just shared though, Kat, because one thing I always, want to emphasize to people is that most of the folks who are doing TJ work are also survivors. And a lot of how we came into this work is that, yeah, the same exact holding and grappling with the complexities that you just shared, Kat, right? And how do we do that? And how do we do it in a way that supports survivors? Because the thing about TJ is there's so many things, but one of the things is that when we talk about state violence, I think it's really easy. It's easy to hate a white police officer, right? But what do you do when the people who are doing the harm and the violence look like you, when you rely on them, when they're part of your kin or your blood or your family, when you still love them and have care for them, even at the same time as you have rage and hatred, whatever it may be, or fear them. And that is, I feel like, what at the crux of why TJ came into existence, was to say, like, I think we're in a moment where we are reaching a boiling point in terms of a culture of disposability on both an environmental level as well as a societal level. And we are seeing these things just crash into each other. We can't keep throwing away things into landfills and exploiting the earth for its resources. We can't keep just locking people up, and we are at the height of mass incarceration. So I say all that to say that when we think about the root causes of harm, that's what I'm saying. That's where I think TJ is so important, because it also includes the conditions in which harm happens. Oh, thank you. We also, when we talk about transformative justice, we talk about the conditions as well, not just the acute form of violence that we're dealing with right now, but we say, what are all the conditions that allowed for that harm or that violence to happen? Both on an individual level, as well as a societal level, as well as a familial level, whatever it may be. And it's not a coincidence that most of us, for example, we can look at our family trees and that the majority of women in our family trees have been in domestic violence or very toxic relationships, right? It's not a coincidence. The way that violence has been passed down. So when I think about the origins of harm, I think about it as being everything from generational cycles of domestic violence or sexual abuse or child sexual abuse, child abuse, to being everything as well connected to white supremacy and systems of oppression and capitalism and colonization and settler colonialism. Like, it's all of these things. And if we don't include them, if we just try to create nice people, we're not gonna be able to stop harm. But if we only focus on state violence or systemic harm and we forget about intimate violence, we're also not going to be able to stop it. Because even in our movements that are doing great work to push back against gentrification, to push back against police brutality, whatever, sexual violence happening within those very movements. So and what I always say is our inability to respond well to violence and harm and abuse inside of our own communities and movements continues to undermine our other political work. Because who cares how successful the campaign was if everybody hates each other by the end of it and nobody will work with each other, right? Our inability to be able to respond to intimate sexual violence, for example, is literally tearing apart our movements and making us more vulnerable to the state. Like that, we are more vulnerable for the state to come in and divide and conquer us, to separate us, to exploit us. So these things are connected in mind. And it's not just about individual people doing individual harm. Yes, they have to take accountability and responsibility for that, for sure. But it's also connected to these larger systems.
My comrade, co-founder of Anti-Police Terror Project, Terha Ak, talks often about the primary predator and the secondary predator, right? And the primary predator is white supremacy and its institutions and everything is created. The secondary predator is created because of the hold the secondary predator accountable, but the state is very good at getting us to focus on the secondary predator without addressing the larger ecosystem that gave birth to the secondary predator. I hate that it's 1:05 and I have to let you all go. I have so much gratitude for both of you in this conversation. JTN is working on building a model to IPV that doesn't involve law enforcement. I know that Danielle has reached out to both of you, and I look forward to being in deep conversation with you again. So folks know we've been talking to Mimi Kim, the founder of Creative Interventions and a co-founder of Incite. She's been a longtime activist and advocate challenging gender-based violence at its intersection with state violence. As a second-generation Korean American, she locates her political work in global solidarity with feminist anti-imperialist struggles, seeking not only the end of oppression, but of the creation of liberation here and now. Thank you, Mimi.
Thank you.
Writer and educator for disability justice and transformative justice. She is passionate about building the skills, relationships, and structures that can transform violence, harm, and generational cycles of abuse within our communities, and that do not rely on or replicate the punitive system we currently live in. Her writings can be found on her blog, Leaving Evidence. Mad respect and admiration for both of you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Check us out next Friday for our next We Take Care of Us series.